Welcome. I'm joined today by Peter in Copenhagen, one of the leading experts from Deloitte in the field of IT and IT financial management. I'm very pleased to have his time to talk about current trends and best practices in that area.
Good morning, Alex. I'm very happy to be here.
Peter, let's start with the topic that currently concerns, I guess, most of us. Predominantly, it's the pandemic that's still ongoing at the end of the year. We've seen a lot of changes in business driven by the situation that COVID has imposed on us. What are the trends and changes you see emerging in the area of IT in that context driven by the pandemic?
From our side, everyone was nervous about the COVID and how their businesses would be impacted by it. And there's not a simple answer. However, what we can see that after the first period, companies are now over-investing in digital and technology. And in Deloitte, we see a lot of demand within e-commerce. So all companies that have a significant part within their e-channels, they are investing heavily there. We can see the core revival. So basically their ERP systems, a lot of replacement programs are in motion at the moment. We can also see cloud adoption. That was already in motion, but has been multiplied in force now by this crisis. Cyber security is also a hot topic and drives a lot of work for us. And finally, I would say that agile ways of working is now becoming the norm within companies as well. So as COVID continues to impact societies, we can just see that these trends will continue over the coming periods or years.
It's very interesting to hear. I assume all these changes you're talking about and the different initiatives also require significant investment, obviously, to drive the change. So how do you see also then the impact from a financial perspective? So the question, how does this affect the interplay of finance and IT in these companies?
Well, I would highlight basically 4 areas within managing IT financials. So the first one would be standard IT financial framework. As IT spend is growing and is a significant part of the cost base in many companies, you revert to having a standard framework to organize and categorize your cost base. So that's one part. Cloud capability is another part, also known as FinOps. So managing cloud cost is a new discipline where you need to understand the shift from CapEx to OpEx, and as well as the consumption of resources, so the types and sizes and demand versus reserved instances. The third part would be supporting agile ways of working. And there you need to go from to a capacity-based budgeting model or funding model, and implementing also lean portfolio management to prioritize which initiative to complete. The final part is handling complex chargeback models. That's because you have a growing significant cost base, and many companies introduced very, very complex chargeback models to be very detailed. Now, that needs to be simplified in many, many cases. So that's my view on the 4 different areas that are going into play in IT finance management at the moment. So Alex, of course, many companies, they strive for increased digital investments. However, given the impact of the crisis, they struggle to increase the budgets for them. So they need to consider the current spend and discuss how to create efficiencies to free up some budget in order to fund that innovation. What is your experience and best practice to do that?
Well, the key is to create transparency, Peter. You need to have a good database and view on your cost and structure it the way you talked about that in cost models, that you can draw the right conclusions where to free up budget. I've seen 3 major levers that you can pull on that. First of all is looking at the demand side. So looking at the chargeback perspective you were just talking about. It is important that you have an understanding why the money is spent. Often IT is a big cost block, and the question is, what is it used for? Structuring it along business services and understanding how and why these business services are used, you can then ask the question, are they needed? Are they needed in that capacity and quality? Or do I have a chance to optimize either the volume or the specifications, perhaps reducing or changing service levels? And therefore you free up budget when you establish a clear market mechanism. So when there's a demand for a certain volume, there's also justification, or if there's not, there's potential to free up budget. The other perspective is looking at it from a supply side. It is important that you have a real total cost of ownership view for your services, that you can break down what drives the cost of a service, and then you can identify on a more granular level where there might be savings potentials, e.g. by sourcing differently, by optimizing, by creating synergies, by consolidating infrastructures. So there are several levers to be applied, but the first step is you need to know where is the major cost driver in order to find a measure to adjust it. And last but not least, a big lever is also a portfolio optimizations. I see a lot of clients running a huge amount of projects, and there is not a good transparency which projects have which business case. And sometimes I think it's better to focus on the real valuable projects, focus your energy and budget there, and also take the tough decision to cut off a long tail of investments who consume resource and money that might not bring the company forward. But that's a complex problem, and again, you need a good database and transparency on the financials around a project to take such a decision. So we've been talking about digital investments, Peter. So digital and investment, that actually brings up the topic of finance and IT. So the CIO is obviously involved, but also the CFO. How do you see the role of these two functions in the whole process that we just discussed?
Well, I think that digital or IT is not alone in experience high cost pressures. That goes across the whole enterprise. Now, the key issue in digital is that there's a requirement to reduce and rationalize current and legacy services while investing heavily in new innovative solutions. So how do you do that? That's the main question I see. And the CIO basically needs to be able to have cross-functional teams, flexible timelines, and going to a product focus and not a project focus. While the CFO, for example, needs fiscal control, that is opposing a little bit what the CIO needs, measurable return on investments, and what is the value creation of these investments. So the CIO and the CFO need to work together in order to solve that equation. So Alex, for the CIO and the CFO, what are the current challenges that they face? And how is the lack of transparency and inadequate data putting them in a disadvantage when it comes to effective cost management?
I think the challenges they face is that the pace of decisions to be made increases. Yeah? So in order to be agile and fast moving in such changing environment we currently see, you need to make quick decisions. So currently, I assume on the table of CIOs and CFOs, a lot of investment requests from business to invest in digitization. And the question is, what is the right investment? And if you don't have the right transparency and the right data, it's very tough, obviously, to take the right decision. In best case, this only means a slowdown. So it takes longer. You need another iteration. You need to go back to your teams in finance and IT to provide further information for the decision making. In the worst case, you take wrong decisions, because often what is underestimated in a digital investments company only see the tip of the iceberg, which is the initial investment. But every solution you bring into the company, every digital solution also has a long-term requirement for resources in maintenance, in adjustment, in operations, and so on. So it's really important to also there look from a TCO perspective at the investment, at the cost and the benefits. And therefore, CIOs and CFOs really rely on a good and correct, transparent database to take the right decision.